And that's my friend Lauren Daigle. I wish, right? Hey, welcome back to Middleism Apologetics. We are continuing on in part two of John Watson's video that they did the other night concerning the nature of the coming. Now, in our last video, we talked about the nature. We went through it with them, and as they expressed their view about him coming in the glory of the Father, then I demonstrated from the New Testament, of course, from the apostles and Paul, how they talked about the nature of it and how John Watson and those never ever touched those verses. So here we are again, going to continue on where they begin to start talking about the church fathers. Now, the interesting thing about the church fathers is that we learn two things from them. The first thing is historical facts. They related who died, who lived, what was going on at the time. They relate things to it, and by their talking about certain people and heretics, the Marcion, whatever, Gnosticism, we can identify the dates between what they were talking about based on other writings, and we can triangulate when they were living, when they died, when they were talking about things, what events were happening. And this is something that the Bible does all the way through. Like, for example, in Luke, Luke goes on and says, okay, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Well, that was tied into history. That's how we know it's not a myth. It's tied into that history. And at that time, when Caesar Augustus put out this tax, during the reign of Caesar Augustus, obviously, is when Jesus was born. So the church fathers did the same thing. They related historical facts. Number two that they did was they showed us what they believed. It does not mean that we follow everything that they said, hook, line, and sinker, and believe it. But we come to understand what they believe, how they came to believe it, what scriptures they used, and things like that. And so that's all we're doing is learning from them how they argued and what they understood. And why is they important? Is because, for example, John died at 98, 100. Well, Polycarp lived to about, it was 220 when he was, right about that time when he was killed and martyred for Christ. And he says, and it was claimed that he was a hearer of John, if not maybe a disciple of John. So Polycarp then would be learning straight from John in one sense. And so we have these testimonies of these things of what happened. Irenaeus, 130 to 220 he lived. He wrote his big works against heresies, and he talked about the Antichrist being future. And he was writing this within, what? We're talking about within 70 to 80 years after John died. So, in that time frame. So it has things that have happened up very closely. And of course, this is all tied to the churches of Asia Minor. And because that's who John wrote to. He wrote his letters to the seven churches in Asia. So they would have gotten those letters, distributed them about, and passed them on from person to person. Yes, these are letters, but audience relevance, how does that apply when they copied these letters and spread them out for everybody to hear besides just them? And it was passed on to everybody so that people could learn from it. So here we are. We're going to jump in right where they're at, and when they start talking about church fathers and all, and we'll respond.
Um, did people understand the nature of the coming of the Lord in the early centuries? After
It's talking about it, and upon the people of my curse to judgment. And of course, verses 8 through 10. So, it's talking about judgment again. It's talking about his Lord's coming.
Did people understand the nature of the coming of the Lord in the early centuries after the destruction of Jerusalem? Some did. Let me point a couple things out before I read a couple of these quotes. First off, do you think we have all of the writings from everybody translated and waiting in an archive somewhere from century 0?
Okay, now this is an argument that Michael Miano used. So obviously he was listening to Michael Miano's thing and talked about, he brought up a quote from DeMar where DeMar talks about all the transcripts that we don't have translated into English or even out of the Greek into English because the scrolls are so old. Very hard to transfer, very hard to translate and bring into any kind of English right now because the difficulty of those things. So what he's wanting to say is that we don't know everything that they believed because we've got all these manuscripts, so that we have no idea of everything that they believed. And the truth is that we have enough of their information from the key players that we do know what they believed. That is not an issue. In fact, Eusebius, when he recorded church history, he got hold of works and papers and papyrus, of course, from several different early church fathers that are mentioned and quoted from, but his original works, like Hippolytus, we don't have any more of it. We have no record of anything that he wrote. It's been gone in fires, damaged over time, and things like this. Polycarp, all we have is a few fragments, I believe, of Polycarp, and other things that have gone on. And the issue is then we have enough of those people that quoted from them that we can piece together more of what they said, and so we do understand what they believed. And because those things were transferred on from person to person, from bishop to bishop, from pastor to pastor, and disciples. They taught each other and they moved on. So it doesn't matter what's in there, but what we do have, we know what they believe based on that.
To today? No. Underneath the Vatican in Rome, the Catholics have sequestered 8, if I remember this correctly, 8 miles worth of catacombs, full top to bottom of ancient writings. You can't get in them. You can't read them. So you're going to tell me that all of those? No. Imagine what successive generations you're going to find when they finally get through some of these things. We might have, according to what I've heard and understand, we might have 10%, maybe, if we're lucky, of ancient writings known. 10%. And you're going to make a judgment on what the ancient peoples believe by 10%?
What they say the odds are is that most of those manuscripts are copies of other copies of other copies. For example, 8 miles, I kind of doubt that that's a legitimate fact, but until we look it up and research it, I'm not bothering with that. But the idea is that for the New Testament alone, they're recorded and translated. They have over 6,000 manuscripts of copies of the New Testament, of copies of this book or that book, this portion of that, whatever, but 6,000 copies of that. So the majority of that stuff could be copies and copies of other things. Because we're talking about a 2,000-year history here of between the earliest manuscripts and some of the older ones, things that were written on papyrus and things that they have. And so you're going to sit there and tell me that, yes, these are going to end up being a lot of copies of things. Very prolific, the writers in the monasteries in copying those things to preserve them. So I'm not challenging his 8-mile thing. It just sounds a little bit more bizarre than anything else. But we have what we need.
Think about, and I don't need that. I can just go to the Bible and find out what they thought.
Exactly. We can see in the scriptures what they thought. Now, here's some interesting things. I'm going to quote a couple things to you. This is what they thought in the early centuries. It aligns with what they taught in the first century, what they inspired writers. Okay, so a man named Josephus, he was a Jewish historian, and 75, this is 5 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, talks about events that took place at that time. Well, listen to this. Now, I'm not saying that this fits with or is fulfillment of prophecy or that this is even inspired, but you'll see why I give this a little bit of credit here in just a moment.
Now, here's the interesting. I'm going to go to it real quick. I'm going to show you something. This is from Church Fathers, the New Advent website. And who we're talking about, of course, that recorded that was Eusebius. And I'm going to show you something. Church history. Now, he lived between 265 and 3 something. This is book 3. And now here it is. He is talking about the first successor of St. Peter in Rome. So this is the time frame right after Christ had died. And the book of Acts and things. This is what he starts in and he's talking about. So they record the first successors of the apostles. Who are these pastors that took over? They're all recorded here. And then we go on. The last siege of the Jews after Christ. There it is. He starts to talk about it. After Nero had held the power 13 years And Galba and Othon ruled in year 6 months. Vespasian, who had become distinguished in the campaigns against the Jews, was proclaimed sovereign in Judea and received the title of emperor from the armies there. Setting out immediately thereafter to Rome, he entrusted the conduct of the war against the Jews to his son Titus. Okay? That's all verifiable history. This is what I was talking about, the early church fathers. This is not about his theology. This is about what he recorded. And I'm going to go on. So he's talking about the church in Jerusalem. He actually talks about them. There it is right here. But the people of the church in Jerusalem have been commanded by revelation vouchsafed to approved men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town called Perea, called Pella. And when they had believed in Christ, had come from Jerusalem, then as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea were entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles, and totally destroyed that generation of impious men. Okay? So here he is talking about that. Now he begins to talk about the famine which oppressed them. The things that would remember, Jesus said there would be famines and wars. Okay, here we go. He's talking about all those things that started to happen. And where does he go? Let's see if we can find this. For the wealthy, okay, now we're bursting. They're talking about the calamities that went on. Found anything, they tormented the owners of the ground that they had denied that he had anything, but if they found nothing, they tortured them on the ground that they had more carefully concealed it. The proof of their not having food was found in the bodies of the poor wretches, perishing for want. Most parts of the houses. Let's see. Thus women snatched the food from the very mouths of their husbands and the children from their fathers, and what was most pitiful of all, mothers from their babes, and while their dearest ones were wasting away in their arms, they would not are ashamed to take away from them the last drops of the supported life. Rioters appeared and robbed them, seized what they were eating, and most forcing it out of their throats. Old men who clung to the food were beaten. Women were concealed in their hands. Their hair was torn. Let's see if he goes on. He talks about the possession of bread, barley, how it was concealed, their madness. Now, to this account, Josephus was relating other things, adds the following. Now, see, he is copying from Josephus. I want to point this out. This demonstrates that that's what he did in accounting for his histories. The possibility of going out of the city being brought to an end, all hope of safety of the Jews was cut off. The famine increased and devoured the people of the houses of the families, and the rooms were filled with dead women and children, and the lanes of the city with the corpses of old men. He's quoting everything from Josephus. I cannot hesitate to declare my feelings compelled, the punishment of madness indeed, and the things that he saw. The different things. He recorded all of that. And from friend with him, I'm looking at this. There. Okay, here it is. And when she had said she slew her son, and having roasted him, she ate one half herself, and covering up the remainder, she kept it. Very soon the riders appeared in the scene, and smelling the nefarious odor, they threatened to slay her immediately unless she showed them what she had prepared. She replied that she had saved an excellent portion for them, and when then she uncovered the remains of the child, they were immediately seized with horror and amazement and stood transfixed. And this is my own son, and the deed is mine. Eat, for I too have eaten, but no more merciful than a woman, no more compassionate than a mother. But if you are to pious and shrink from my sacrifice, I have already eaten it. Let the rest also remain for me. That's exactly what I read from Deuteronomy 28 in the siege of Jerusalem. That's what Moses prophesied in Deuteronomy 28. And wow, I mean, there it is, proven fact that it happened. So you don't necessarily have to get everything from Josephus. You can go to. Now, what does Eusebius next say? He starts to quote about the predictions of Christ from the Olivets. Interesting, isn't it? Then the signs which precedes the war. He talks about them. At one time, a star in a form like a sword stood over the city, like a comet. And he's testifying to these are the signs that happened during those days. These were visible signs that this day was coming. And Josephus and the works which we have left, meaning, yes, there was Josephus and other things that he used, but a lot of that stuff could and was lost. The manner in which Josephus mentions the divine books, and he talks about the different books Josephus did. Goes on, Vespasian commanded the descendants of David to be sought, Encles and Bishop Barome. He goes on and explains these different people, Clement, for example. Then he goes into the time of persecution under Domitian. And we will stop right there. And the thing that I'm showing you, though, that is that Eusebius is recording the facts, and he quotes from Josephus to give him credibility.
Josephus said, beside these signs, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month of Artemisius, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable in nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Not just Jerusalem, the city surrounding it. They all saw these things.
Okay, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to point out something. He's going to make the claim this was the coming of Jesus. But again, from Zechariah 12 and 14, on the day that he comes, he protects the inhabitants of Jerusalem. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Acts 1. Jesus himself will descend. Jesus is not chariots. He is not a vision of chariots and of things running around the clouds. That is not Jesus. Those you can call signs, you can call them whatever you want, but that is not Jesus coming back in the same manner in which he left. Paul said Jesus himself will descend and appear. And we talked about that with the word epiphania in the last thing. So it doesn't matter what they say here. That was not the second coming. Or is that how Paul described what the
According to him.
would be?
Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise. And after that they heard a sound of a great multitude saying, let us remove hence. Had these voices saying, we're getting out of the temple. They said that they reckoned that was God saying his presence is leaving us. He's no longer.
Okay, and I'll tell you exactly why that is not God. That is something else. Possibly imaginations or whatever it might have been. But remember, at Christ's death, the veil tore in two. And when the veil tore in two, it says from top to bottom. Now, if that veil represents us being separated from God, and God had to stand behind the veil in order to keep us separated from him and being into his presence, then if that veil torn in two, God is signifying that the sin now has been atoned for by the one-time sacrifice according to Hebrews, and no longer is any offering required. It's been dealt with. God now can come out of the temple, and be with men, because there is no longer a barrier, anything to keep man from coming into God's presence. So in essence, it was an idea that with the veil rent in two, God left the temple. He was no longer there. He no longer needed sacrifices of bulls or anything else. That was all done with because of the one sacrifice of Christ.
Longer with us. Then that's what Josephus said. Did they see some amazing things in the first century? Listen to this. He goes on, a supernatural apparition was seen too amazing to be believed. What I am now to relate would, I imagine, be dismissed as imaginary had this not been vouched for by eyewitnesses, then followed by subsequent disasters that deserve to be thus signalized. For before sunset, chariots were seen in the air over the whole country, and armed battalions speeding through the clouds and encircling the cities. What did Josephus see? Okay, maybe he was making it up so that he could, being a Jew. Actually, if everyone hadn't seen this and he came up with this on his own, he would have been probably
Yeah,
executed.
they'd have killed him. They'd stoned him to death.
So this gets even better. So check this out. Another guy named Tacitus. Here's what he writes. He's a Roman historian, just a few years later, and he says he's a pagan. He has no reason to support Jewish belief, Christian belief. He does not.
Okay. See, no prior or no futurist is going to deny that those signs and things appear because God said signs and those things would appear. But again, none of those signs, none of those things were Jesus himself that came. So yes, me being a little different than most futurists, I fully believe that the evidence is there that everything that about the Olivet was fulfilled in that generation in 70 AD. But that was not the second coming.
Care.
Yeah, they're wiped out.
Yeah, care. But here's what he says. Prodigies had occurred, but their expiation by the offering of victims or solemn vows is held to be unlawful by a nation of the Jews, which is the slave of superstition and the enemy of true beliefs. So he believes that the Jews were the enemy of true beliefs. That's what he just said. In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. He relates this to the Jews. Why? He got it. Even though he didn't like it, he got it. Of glittering armor, a sudden lightning flash from the clouds lit up the temple. The doors of the holy place abruptly opened. A superhuman voice was heard to declare that the gods were leaving it, and in the same instant came the rushing tumult of their departure. Few people placed a sanitary interpretation upon this. The majority were convinced that the ancient scriptures of their priests alluded to the present as the very time when the Orient would triumph, and from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world.
Okay.
Two ancient historians say there were some remarkable things going on over the skies in Jerusalem and the surrounding cities that I can't explain.
Nobody's arguing against any of those things.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Now we have to throw those out because they defend our position.
In 71, listen to this. I read this a week or two ago, so I'll just be quick about this. The Jewish Sibylline Oracle said, let me just read it. On Jerusalem, let's talk about Jerusalem. This is what the Jewish Sibylline oracles say in 71, roughly. He seized the divinely built temple and burned the citizens and peoples who went into it, men whom I rightly praised. For on his appearance the whole creation was shaken and kings perished, and those in whom sovereignty remained destroyed a great city and a righteous people. They said he appeared.
Who did?
At the destruction of the temple.
Who appeared?
Clement said, man, you just go through all of these things. I wish I had time just to read all of them. I got about 40 of these quotes, and I just keep adding more as I find them. But the simple fact of the matter is, here's what in 130, and I'll make this my last one. Barnabas said, it shall be in the last days that the Lord shall deliver up the sheep of the pasture and the fold and the tower thereof to destruction. And it so happened as the Lord has spoken. So he says that this came to pass just as Jesus said, exactly the way that he said. And on and on.
Okay, let's go to Church Fathers. We're going to go to the Epistle of Barnabas, and we're going to look at that quote. And I'm going to show you something here. And this is the problem with the scholarship of John Watson here. Okay. A, B, C. There's Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas. We'll load that up. Now, I already know where basically these quotes come from. And we'll take a second here to find it. Okay, I saw that one. I think this is, I'm going to find it, and I could go back here real quick. And Let's find that quote. I've got it listed right here. Let's find out. Okay, got it. All right, I'm going to show you something. He was quoting, I believe, from the 14th or the 2nd. He doesn't give us the actual thing where this was said. And I'm trying to find, I know it's right in here somewhere. Oh, here it is. All right. Moreover again, he says, behold, they have cast down this temple, even they have built it up again. It has so happened, for though through their going to war, this is what he just quoted, it was destroyed by their enemies, and now they, as the servants of their enemies, shall rebuild it. And of course, it was started to be rebuilt within just a few years after Jerusalem's destruction. They started to do it again. Again, it was revealed that the city and the temple and the people of Israel would be given up. For the scripture says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the Lord will deliver up the sheep of his pasture and their sheepfold and tower to destruction. And so, as he read, and so it happened as the Lord has spoken. Let us inquire then if there still is a temple of God. There is, where he can himself declared and make it finish it. For it shall come in the week that is complete. The temple of God shall be built in the glory of the name of the Lord. But the point is yes, it all was fulfilled. Okay? That's what he's saying. Okay, let me go back up to 15. And I'm going to read here what it says. Okay, now here's the quote, and I've got my cursor on this. I could outline it a little bit for you, but right in through there. This implies that the Lord will finish all things in 6,000 years. For a day to him is like 1,000 years, and he himself testifies, behold, today will be as 1,000 years. Therefore, my children, in 6 days, and got 7 days rest. This means, here's the quote, this means when he, the Son, coming again, shall destroy the time of the wicked man, and judge the ungodly, and change the sun, moon, and stars, and he shall truly rest on the 7th day. This means when his Son coming, future, shall destroy. Coming again. They put it in again there because coming is a future tense that's in there from the Greek. So here he is confessing that the Son is coming at a future time. Wow. Shall destroy the time of the wicked man. And he's saying the Antichrist and all that, the wicked man has not come yet. His coming again will happen in the future. So here's John Watson talking about a passage where he believes and he talks about Jerusalem's destruction, which Barnabas was written soon after the 70. And then he also says there was a future coming. So there is no way that he's talking about and believing that the second coming happened in 70 AD. You cannot apply it. That would be absolutely dishonest. But, see, they're doing an association thing. Just because they think the temple and all that was destroyed in 70 AD, and they affirm that all that prophecy was fulfilled, therefore it was also about the second coming. But no, here's Barnabas who said what? Future second coming.
On and on and on. There you go. No, I want one more. Let me do this. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah.
150, Melito said, who will contend against me? Let him stand before me. It is I who delivered the condemned. It's talking about Christ.
Come on.
I who gave life to the dead. It's talking about resurrection. I gave life to the dead. Okay, maybe he's not, but let's keep reading. It is I who raised up the buried. In 150, in the homily of Pascha, Melito said, Jesus raised the dead, or the buried. People argue with me, it is I, says Christ, who destroyed death. That's a preterist teaching.
No, it isn't.
We believe that death was destroyed in the first century, death being
I'm looking for
this
something else.
separation from God, and it so happened as the Lord has spoken. So he says that this came to pass, just as Jesus said. exactly the way that he said. And on and on and on and on and on. There you go. No, one more. Let me do this. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah.
150, Melito said, who will contend against me? Let him stand before me. It is I who delivered the condemned. It's talking about Christ. I who gave life to the dead. It's talking about resurrection. I gave life to the dead. Okay, maybe he's not, but let's keep reading. It is I who raised up the buried. In 150, in the homily of Pascha, Melito said, Jesus raised the dead, or the buried. Who will argue with me? It is I.
Because, okay, he's saying this is the resurrection, and he would be applying that to a resurrection quote that didn't happen at his second coming. Here's the problem with this. He just talked about Jesus being raised from the dead and all that. Matthew 27:52, after his resurrection, there was a resurrection of many people who were in the grave and came out. So that is the other resurrection, and that could be very well what he is pointing to. But remember, homily is just a sermon where the pastor waxes elegant on what he believes and spiritualizes things.
It says Christ, who destroyed death.
Now,
that's a preterist.
No, and let me put it real clearly. It never says that he destroyed death. He conquered death. He overcame death. But if he conquered and destroyed it, then nobody else would die. He didn't end it. He conquered it. He himself conquered it so that other people afterwards in the resurrection will also conquer it, and because of him. So this is not talking about the ending of death. Otherwise, we wouldn't be dying today. But his power and authority over death.
Teaching. We believe that death was destroyed in the first century. Death being this.
And death, okay, he's going to define
this separation from God.
Okay, death, that spiritual death was done away with on the cross because now God has reconciled man to him. By his death, man have now been reconciled. He's talking about the new birth. That is not about the death that we're talking about that Jesus did because Jesus conquered physical death with his resurrection. It says now death and Hades no longer has power over me. He has the keys to death and hell. So we're talking about physical death since he rose from the dead. He didn't rise from spiritual death. He rose from the physical dead.
God and the Hadean realm, Isaiah 13:14 and so forth. Isaiah.
See, he just said out of the Hadean realm. So he's talking about a physical bodily resurrection there, and he's admitting that's what it's referring to. Maybe
1 Corinthians 15. He says, this is in 150. This is what, 70, 80 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. But I'm not done. It is I who triumphed over the enemy. Aaron Tyler was saying, Satan hasn't been defeated yet. Jesus came. This kills me, Trent.
No, Aaron never said that that Satan has not been defeated. He never said that. What he said is that Satan is still alive and allowed to rule. He has not been bound. The Christian has authority over Satan. That does not mean that Satan has been bound up like and destroyed and no longer exist. I mean, good gosh, the people are still demon possessed today, and those things still happen today. And to say that Satan and his minions are bound up in hell, that's a tragedy. That's a lie that you believe from the enemy.
Yeah,
they want to say Jesus came, he did all this fantastic work, he was powerful, he's the Lord of Lords, he's sovereign of sovereigns, but he didn't defeat Satan.
He did conquer the grave from the grave, and Satan, of course, is defeated. That's not what it's talking about, and that's not what he's implying, that somehow that Satan still rules. It was even Peter who said, what? The prince and power of the air. He still exists.
Really? It is I who triumphed over the enemy, and having trodden down Hades and bound the strong man and have snatched up mankind to the heights of heaven.
And of course, this is a homily. He's waxing eloquent over what Christ and what has happened within church, that they have authority over Satan and his.
If that isn't preterist teaching, and I don't know what is, and that was 150.
That's eschatology.
Yeah. Now, he may not have had everything right, but he got that right. Okay, I'm done. Go ahead.
No, that's it. I think that, God came in the clouds, and Christ comes in the clouds, It's not a physical, fleshly thing. It is a spiritual thing. And I think that we gave a pretty good argument of what it means to come in the glory of the Father.
Yeah, and you didn't, because you didn't deal with all the other things. And so that was not, yeah, the coming of his glory was in 70 AD, but that was not the second coming. We've already established that with Parousia and Epiphania. And when it comes to church fathers, let's see if there's anything else I can add to it. The dating, this refers to the dating and all of that. I could go through the other part. I'm not going to. The idea is that that Christ conquered, overcame Satan by rising from the dead, so therefore he has control of death and Hades. But his coming, that was not the second coming. I've demonstrated. What's the point of kind of?
And it's equal to God,
and it shows the nature of his return.
And
You're gonna if Jesus was coming in the glory of his Father. So this is summarizing. Tell me if I got this right. If I'm understanding what you're saying.
John said in Second John or First John chapter 3, we shall see him as he is, and nobody ever declared that they saw him. None of those people. Everything you heard him talk about with those church fathers and the events and the signs and the wonders and all that, not once did he ever say anything about seeing or anybody seeing Jesus. Yet Paul repeatedly said, he will appear at his coming. We shall see him. Every eye will see him. But you notice that John never dealt with any of those verses when it comes to the nature. When the nature is talked about, we're talking about how he will come. And so this is a Don Preston argument, 100%, and it's completely lacking and baseless.
You're saying if Jesus said he was coming in the glory of his Father, we go back to the Old Testament and we look at the glory of the Father when he.
But you ignored, of course, what I pointed out was Zechariah 12 and 14. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Well, if he's standing on the Mount of Olives and it's his feet, that's the person. And he will be king over all the earth. He will rule. And all the nations will come to him year after year to worship the king. He's not going to be invisible, folks.
He came. And we see that he never came in the flesh, even though he was present, like you showed in Isaiah 19.
Yeah. So he never came in the flesh.
Then that means Jesus is going to come just like his Father.
And nope. He came the first time. 19 says he visibly, bodily comes. So, you can read my book and you can go on and on and on, and you just have to wrestle with it. But the fact is that he did not come in 70 AD, and all the evidence that I'm presenting here in opposition to what they're saying is mounted and mounted up, and he is required to have to deal with it. All right, I'm keeping this short as much as possible. Thanks, guys, for listening and watching. If you have any questions or anything else, please come back and subscribe, pass it on. But the hope is to dialogue. And like I've said before, I'm not willing to debate and argue with people who are not like John Watson here. He's not informed. He doesn't deal with the parousia and all of that. That shows his lack of study. And what is the point of arguing with somebody who almost has to be educated in order to even have the discussion with them? And I don't mean that in a mean way, but it's just apparent with what I showed you in these videos and talking about it that his scholarship on those points is it's not fully there. So thank you again for watching, and we will see you guys on the backside.